The dwarfs had a love for mountains and deep caverns, and they would use these landscapes to build some of their greatest mansions. These mountains were the perfect home for the dwarfs, for apart from offering them protection from their enemies, they also contained abundant riches and precious gems and ores for the dwarven mines. Though even with all of these benefits, they did have one glaring weakness, for the mountains were no place to grow crops or bring up animals. And so it's interesting to wonder, where exactly did the dwarfs obtain their food, and how were they able to sustain their people? Hey guys, it's Carl here, and in today's episode, we'll be exploring how the dwarfs fed their armies and people. So first of all, we know for a fact that the dwarfs were obsessed with refining their skills and arts, and they refused to dedicate any time to growing or finding their own food. For that extra time gave them the freedom to reach new levels of mastery in their crafts. Even so, the dwarfs still had to get food from somewhere, and as we mentioned earlier, it wasn't possible for them to grow a sustainable amount of food in their mansions. And so, the dwarfs would have to find a solution to this problem. They would soon learn that they could offer their skills, or even the vast riches that they acquired, as trade for food with the other races of Middle-Earth. And through these trades and partnerships, many strong alliances were born. Out of all the races, men would prove to be their greatest allies, and many of their partnerships actually started off for military reasons rather than trade. We know that at the start of the Second Age, many orcs used to attack the men that lived in the Vales of the Anduin and the Dwarfs of the Misty Mountains, and these two factions would come together to fight off this orc threat. For the men of these lands were very poor smiths, and they also lacked iron for their weapons, and so the dwarfs offered to arm them with many fine blades of dwarven craft. In return, the men would have to ride out to scout the nearby lands and keep watch for any orc movements, and the dwarfs would use this information to prepare for any orc attacks. Now, communication is crucial for any alliance to succeed, and so the dwarfs would slowly learn the common speech so that they could forge stronger bonds with their men allies. And over time, a great respect began to grow between these two races, and sometimes even friendship, which eventually led to trade. The men of these lands greatly admired the dwarven skills, and they were very eager to learn from them. And they would grow crops for the dwarfs and bring up animals for them, while the dwarfs helped to build their roads or even houses for these men, and they sold them tools, weapons and armor, and many other tools of their crafts. Some of these men would even go so far as to beg the dwarfs to take up their sons as apprentices, and they would pay them handsomely in food supplies. Now at first the dwarfs took advantage of men's ignorance, and these trades were heavily in the dwarfs' favor. However, over time, men would slowly become wiser, and they developed their own skills, and their trade relationship with the dwarfs would become more balanced. I'd also like to point out that the Dwarves of Moria also had a very strong relationship with the Elves of Erebor, and in fact the west gate of Moria was built so that they could travel and trade easily with these elves, and so it's possible that these elves also offered them some food in return. Now if something had to happen to their allies, the food supply of the dwarfs would be compromised, and I believe that they must have had some incredible stores of grain and supplies just in case this ever happened. After all, we see how in the year 1697, Sauron's armies attacked the Elves of Erebor, and they drove away the men of the Vales of the Anduin, and the Dwarfs of Moria had no choice but to shut their gates and hold out inside. They would manage to survive for many years locked inside of their kingdom, and this suggests that they must have had some emergency food stores to sustain their people. Now this close relationship between men and dwarfs wasn't exclusive to those of Moria, and we can actually find many other examples throughout their history of similar trading partnerships. For example, we know that the lands that surrounded the dwarven kingdom of Erebor were very fertile, and the men of Dale used to grow crops and fruit trees there, and these two factions had a very strong relationship. The men of Dale would give them food, while the dwarfs of Erebor gave them armor, weapons, and objects of beauty. And after the Battle of the Five Armies, this friendship was renewed once more, and Dale was rebuilt with the dwarfs' help, and they filled it with incredible fountains, waterways and roads. It seems that these men would also give the dwarfs a snack called cram that was great for long journeys, and it's implied that the dwarfs of Erebor would also sometimes get honey cakes from the Beornings. We even see some examples of this helpful relationship between men and dwarfs in the Fourth Age, such as the dwarfs of the Glittering Caves that were led by Gimli. For we're told that in the years to come, his people would build some impressive works in Rohan and Gondor, such as repairing the great gates of Minas Tirith with mithril and steel. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the dwarfs didn't only trade with men, and we know that sometimes they would also trade with hobbits. Because of these trades, the dwarfs felt that the hobbits weren't very smart, since they didn't bargain hard like men, and they would pay the dwarfs whatever price they demanded for their iron. Some of the hobbits would buy tools from these dwarfs, along with dwarf boots for muddy weather, and we know that the dwarfs had actually helped the hobbits to improve their hobbit homes, because they used to be rather basic. It seems that this relationship between the dwarfs and hobbits would go all the way back to the early years of the Second Age, when the Harfoots used to live in the Vales of the Anduin, for we're told that this particular branch of hobbits had much to do with the dwarfs in the ancient times. Now it's also worth mentioning that the dwarfs used to work with the elves sometimes, especially in the First Age, though their relationship was always somewhat cold. After all, the dwarfs of Nogrod and Belegost had built a great road that passed into Beleriand, so that they could trade with the elves, and we know that the dwarfs had helped to build the elven halls of Nargothrond and Menegroth, and they even sold weapons and armor to these elves. I don't think it's far-fetched that the elves might have given the dwarfs food in return, though we know that these two races would eventually break away from each other after the dwarfs of Nogrod ransacked the elven kingdom of Doriath, for this event poisoned their relationship, and they would have very few dealings after this. Now I'd like to point out that just because the dwarves didn't like to find or grow their own food, it doesn't mean that they weren't capable of doing so if they were in a desperate situation. There was a special type of root that could be found hidden beneath the ground, and only the dwarfs were aware of it, and when cooked, it actually tasted somewhat like bread. These roots were a closely guarded dwarven secret, and none of the other races knew about them, and they could very easily be stored for a long period of time without them going to waste. I also feel that if the dwarfs were desperate, they could always eat some fish from the lakes that could be found beneath the mountains or outside their kingdoms, and I imagine that some mushrooms might have also been found in these caves. We need to give the dwarfs credit, for they were a hardy people that planned ahead, and I'm sure that they would have had an elaborate system to make sure that their people didn't run out of food. Did you guys know about the trade relationships of the dwarfs, particularly that with the hobbits? And can you think of any other methods which they could have used to feed their people, apart from the ones that we mentioned? As always, I'd really like to thank my patrons. You guys really helped to make this channel possible, and I deeply appreciate your support, especially my Wizard-Tier Patrons: Jacob Williams, Michelangelo, T-Gorman, James Tugel, Andrew Bomer, Mike Feeney, Roland Mervold, Jeremy Pontier, and Big Boy. If you too would like to help and support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, I'll be leaving a link to my Patreon page in the video description. You can also support this channel by checking out our store and by following us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and joining our Discord server. You can find all of these links in the video description. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-Earth.